All right, I know that this video is going to make some people sad or mad, and then I'm going to trigger something. So today we are going to do NDEs, near-death experiences, and this is honestly in modern times where we have collectively placed a lot of faith in order to kind of find a new way to cheat death. So this isn't just some like ivory tower idea where I'm just going to ask you like, oh, consider the ethics of this. Like people have their identity wrapped around these stories pointing to something real. And if I challenge that, they get very upset the way that a religious person discredits you when you say something that challenges their identity. So this is a video where I know going into this that I'm going to make people very upset. And just to be clear, before people come at me and accuse me of being closed-minded or being biased towards materialism, just know that I want to be wrong about this. Like, I am a mother, and as such, I'm fundamentally not okay with the idea that one day my child will want to come talk to me and I won't be there. Like, I'm okay with not being okay, but I'll never like fully be okay about that. So I want there to be magic here. I really do. I just haven't found enough evidence that warrants a jump into the supernatural. So I'm going to lay all that out and then ask you guys what you think. But just know that even though I'm skeptical, I do want to be wrong. Like, that is my bias. I do want to be wrong. So you tell me what you think at the end of this, if you can make it through this video, because we've got a lot to cover. So thousands of people around the world report the same strange experience after being clinically dead or near death. They're floating above their bodies. They're traveling through a tunnel, seeing a light, meeting beings of love. Are these just glimpses of the afterlife? Are these just tricks of a dying brain? And so in this video, we're going to really focus in on a no-nonsense approach at looking at near-death experiences. What are they? What are they not? And what might this tell us about consciousness and death? And I want to be as open as I can to the possibilities without jumping headfirst into nonsense without reason. And so again, at the end, I just would like to know what you think about this one, because this is a topic that people will get really mad about. I've even had people on TikTok, when I've talked about this, say like, okay, now I'm going to be sad all day because whatever I was talking about really challenged their beliefs in NDEs. And so I know that that's coming is all I'm going to say. So let's dive in. A near-death experience is exactly what it sounds like. It's something that happens to people when they're clinically dead or right at the edge of death, like a heart attack, major trauma, drowning, and while under deep anesthesia. As they say in The Princess Bride, mostly dead is better than all dead. And the stories people tell are surprisingly consistent. You've probably heard the stories. Someone dies on the operating table, their heart stops, they have no brain waves, and then suddenly they're floating above their body. They're watching the doctors work on them. They feel very calm. There's a tunnel, there's light. Sometimes there's loved ones. Sometimes it's like God itself. Sometimes they're told it's not your time. And then just like that, they're back in their body and they change. Like there's like these experiences change people. Like their fear of death will go down, for example. Just like when you do psychedelics, often people will have less fear of death after that for the rest of their life. So this seems to be not a new phenomenon either. We don't know how old this is in our history, but Plato talked about a soldier who died in battle and came back to life and described another realm. We have the Tibetan Buddhist Book of the Dead, which outlines visions that occur in the space between death and rebirth, and they do have some evidence of exploring this space. But the modern fascination with NDEs really exploded in 1975 when a psychiatrist named Raymond Moody published a life called Life After Life, and that's when the term near-death experience took off. So since then, we've seen thousands of stories, many in hospitals and ERs and during surgeries, and today you can, of course, find entire YouTube channels and books full of these stories. Some are from deeply religious people, some are from atheists who came back completely transformed and say now they believe in something after death. Some are from children. Even blind people report some visual imagery during NDEs, which really challenges our understanding of perception. So if you're spiritual or religious, you might just instantly see this as proof that the soul continues after death, that we return to a place of love or light, and that there's something more to life. If you're a skeptic, you may just say, this is what a dying brain does. As oxygen drops, as brain systems shut down, the visual cortex can create these tunnel-like effects. A flood of endorphins might explain the euphoria. Maybe the brain releases DMT, which is a powerful hallucinogen. The whole thing could just be a last comforting dream while the brain is crashing. So let's lay out what happens in an NDE and the possible explanations on the table. So the first thing that really stands out is out-of-body experiences. This is something I've experienced many times, not because I've died many times, just it's something that you can access in other ways than dying. This is when someone feels like they've left their physical body and they're floating above it. And it's interesting that it's really never below it. It's always above. And they might describe hovering near the ceiling, seeing the doctors or paramedics working on them, and feeling totally calm and detached. It's one of the most commonly reported features of NDEs, and it's very powerful. It makes people feel like they must have some kind of soul or consciousness that's separate from their brain and body. But here's the thing, OBEs don't just happen during near-death situations. We can actually reproduce this in a lab. I could give you a guided meditation. Those take a long time, or a drug right now, or put you in a lab and push on your brain and give you this experience. I've done both the drug side of that and the meditation side of that. And I've had powerful subjective experiences where the idea that I'm a Brittany on the ground, like there would be no anchor for that thought, like I'm gone. I can go there with or without drugs. So out-of-body experiences feel incredibly real, but we have a growing amount of evidence that they are not evidence of a soul literally leaving the body. They're experiences created by the brain, specifically a breakdown in the way that the brain is integrating sensory information about your body's position in space. So there's one part of the brain in particular called the TPJ. It sits at the intersection of where your brain processes vision, touch, balance, and body awareness. And when scientists stimulate this area, like with electrodes in an epilepsy patient, they can induce the sensation of leaving the body. Like if I could get into your brain and touch your brain, you would experience this. And people will say things like, I'm floating, or I'm seeing myself from above. And this happens even though they're still lying on the table fully awake. And also when you do this and try to put like an object like on top of a counter, and ask them to try to see it, they actually won't see anything. And so we've tried this in labs to see if you're actually leaving your body, and we don't have any evidence for that. We don't have any like smoking gun evidence for that. So in 2007, researchers in Switzerland conducted a famous experiment where they used virtual reality and this tactile stimulation to mess with somebody's body perception. It's a wild study, honestly. So here's how it works. A person wore goggles, showing them a video of themselves from behind, and then the experimenter tapped the person's brain while simultaneously showing them tapping in the VR feed, and the brain started to get confused, and the participant began to identify with the virtual body they were seeing rather than their actual body. So some felt like they were floating behind themselves, disconnected from their physical body. Another famous example is sleep paralysis. This is when your brain is asleep, but your body is asleep, but your mind is awake. And people report out-of-body experiences during this state. Some float, some see their own sleeping body, some even feel like they can move through walls or ceilings. But all of this is tied to how the brain is processing sensory input or lack thereof during REM sleep. So OBEs feel incredibly real. You really can put on some VR goggles and I'll push on your brain and you will feel like you are your VR body. Like that seems to be something that we can reproduce in a lab. But now we have to consider, like, does it point to something more? Because the brain is capable of creating incredibly convincing illusions. Just because something feels real doesn't mean that it is real. Think about dreams. You can dream of flying. You can dream of visiting dead relatives or talking to people that you've never met. And in that moment, like I had a dream last night, I was like in court for something, which I'm going to have to explore why I'm in court being judged about something. And I woke up and like, there was that half second where like, oh, that's a dream. I'm in reality. But when I was in it just a few seconds before, it felt like reality, right? That's how OBEs work too. The brain stimulates an external viewpoint and we interpret it as leaving the body. But here's the thing. If your consciousness truly left your body, you should be able to gather information you couldn't otherwise perceive. And when this has been tested, like putting hidden symbols around a room, there's no good evidence that people who are experiencing out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences experiences can report those symbols. They see what they expect to see, not necessarily what's actually there. The brain fills that in even when your eyes are closed based on what it knows subconsciously about what is going on in the room. And there was a time not that long ago when the United States government took out-of-body experiences seriously enough to fund research into whether we could use this for spying, because people were claiming that they could leave their body and travel other places. So yes, the CIA, the US Army, and other government agencies actually invested millions of dollars into projects exploring psychic phenomena, including remote viewing, the idea that someone could leave their body and see or sense things far away. So in the 70s, during the Cold War, rumors started circulating that the Soviets were kind of doing this, that they were investigating psychic warfare. And of course, not wanting to fall behind in any area, we launched our own top secret project called Stargate. And this was not just like a fringe side hustle. Like, the research was run out of places like Stanford, and later the Defense Intelligence Agency. Scientists and military personnel worked with self-proclaimed psychics, including a man named Ingo Swann, who claimed he could mentally travel to the moon and describe it in detail. One of the most famous participants was Joe McMoneagle, who said that he could access information about secret military bases and hostage situations while being in an altered state and having out-of-body experiences. But by the 90s, after 2 decades of trying and experimenting, the CIA declassified the project and shut it down. Here's why: the results were inconsistent, they weren't scientifically replicable, and it was happening at no better than chance when rigorously tested. It only worked if you cherry-picked something and used hindsight bias to make it seem like magic. So a 1995 CIA review of the program, after reviewing all of the data, concluded that remote viewing has not been shown to have any value in intelligence operations. They just shut the whole thing down. So so all of that evidence and all the studies that we've done, you can look at it, you can read it, you can sometimes like try to fit something in, like, oh, they see this, and that's kind of like what's going on over here. And like with hindsight bias, you can make a few things sound like it's great, but when you look at the expanse of the studies, it's very clear that these people feel like they're leaving their bodies. They feel like they're going somewhere else, but they're not actually going anywhere. So what we know so far with out-of-body experiences is that this is a real experience for sure. But there has been nothing that ever shows that you are actually leaving your body even when you feel like it is. And you can, in a lab, with drugs, with meditation, with brain stimulation, I can give you this feeling. And I can put a number or object somewhere in the room that you don't know of, and your subconscious has no way of knowing of, and you won't see it. Like we've tried, nothing. You will not see it because you didn't really leave your body, and your brain is just losing its sense of where it is in space. So this is where I can hear you. I can hear you already saying, but this story, they couldn't have known this. They couldn't have known that the doctor said this. They couldn't have known that their mother-in-law was in the hall having this conversation or whatever. They couldn't have known, their eyes were closed. They couldn't have known that the doctor had mustard on his tie. I have a few things to say about this. First of all, you have no idea what your brain knows. You have no idea. You get 11 million bits of information per second. Your conscious mind pays attention to 20 bits of information per second. You didn't remember that the doctor had a stain on his tie, but you may have seen it. Your brain just decided that it wasn't important. So it decided it didn't tell you about it. It didn't alert your conscious attention. So when you take out what the subconscious could have known in these studies, the magic results go away entirely. There are people who can fly. I love this idea, like they couldn't have done this. They couldn't have known. There are people who can fly over Rome once and draw the entire city from memory. There are people who can hear a song and play it. There are people who you can ask what day of the week was January 2nd, 1975, and they'll say it's a Tuesday. Like, you have no idea what your brain knows. Like, you really don't. All of us can drive and end up in a part of town and we completely spaced out. Like, our brain was driving without us. Like, you'll wake up in a part of town almost and you'll be like, oh man, like who drove me here? Like, I was totally lost in thought. Your brain was driving without your attention the entire time. So first of all, actually don't know what the subconscious knows and then what picture it can paint with that information as a projection. So when someone says they can't have known, we actually really don't know what they can or can't have known because we have no way to access what their brain actually knows or not. And you can't ask someone, do you know this? Because you actually don't know how much you know or don't know either. Second, let's say that there's a story, and I've heard some good ones. Like there are a couple that I'm like, wow, I really struggle with how to explain that one. So let's say that there really is a story where you could not have known a conversation happening in another room. But when we look at the data of everything people report, the number of those stories is very small. So let me give you another example. One of my favorite podcasts is This Jungian Life. And they did a study where they tried to transmit an image through dreams. They're just playing around with it. And hundreds of people signed up and listened to something before bed and then reported their dreams. And this is like not related to NDE stuff. I'm just using this as a different example. So the guy who is on the podcast, he was thinking of a lion, and most people didn't dream of a lion. Like the hundreds of people didn't dream of a lion, but one dreamt of a fuzzy mammalian beast. Is that enough information to say that you can transmit information through dreams? No, that would be bad science because that's no better than random. And that includes a lot of hindsight bias. But if I were to tell the story that, hey, a guy was thinking about a lion and that night I dreamt of a lion, it was like a fuzzy mammal, this fuzzy beast, it would be like, wow, that feels really magical. But when you look at the science, it's like, well, hundreds of people didn't get that image, and we're using hindsight bias, and we have no idea if that was just a random hit or if this is happening at more than random. So when you start doing real science, the magic just kind of goes away, even though the story isolated feels really magical, right? So brains do this on their own, which is why it makes it a bias. You don't know that your brain is doing this. So if you think you don't do that, like unless you're actively fighting against hindsight bias with these kinds of controlled studies, that bias is going to show up and you're not going to know that your brain is doing it. Human brains are not recorders. We predict what we see and we look back and see patterns, even patterns that aren't statistically there. Your brain is doing that without you. If you think of the other example is if you think of your mom 100 times and on the 100th time while you're thinking of mom, she calls you, your brain will actually forget that you thought about her 100 times and she didn't call. And you're going to feel this pattern because the pattern is based on meaning that, oh my God, when I was thinking of my mom called me. There must be something, magical. We're connected on a quantum level, whatever. And so again, there are stories that sound too good to be true. Absolutely. But when you account for what your brain could know, and what the brain is doing when it loses its perception of space, and you account for bias, and you account for is this happening more than random, and you actually test this. We don't even have one good study showing something magical, like someone knowing there's a hammer at the top of a cabinet despite them feeling like they were floating up there and looking around. Second, these projections of the brain are very shaped by culture, not ultimate reality. So for example, in the United States and other Christian nations, even if you're an atheist, because it seeps in, right? It's in the air. People often report seeing Jesus, angels, divine judgment. They might describe standing before a light that somehow feels like God, even if no words are spoken. There's often a life review that mirrors the idea of final judgment, watching your actions, feeling what others felt because of you. Oh, excuse me. But in India, it's different. People have reported meeting Yama, which is the Hindu god of death. In some cases, they've been told that there's been a mistake and they were not ready to die yet, which is an idea that fits neatly into a reincarnation framework. The interesting thing is that in Japan, NDEs more often involve imagery related to water or crossing a river, which connects to traditional Japanese beliefs about the journey into the afterlife. And in children's NDEs, especially very young kids who don't have firm religious beliefs yet, the experiences are more abstract. Some see like loved ones and pets, but some see cartoon characters or animals. One child reported being comforted by a shimmering blue dog. These experiences are meaningful to them, but not wrapped in religious language yet because they haven't been cultured yet into some religious language for what's happening. And so you'll just get random things, a blue a blue cartoon character saying it's going to be okay. So what does that tell us? To me, that suggests that the content of NDEs is really filtered through your personal and cultural worldview, and what you're projecting is based on that worldview. So if you're a Christian and your brain has a built-in library of images and expectations that get activated when you're close to death, that's what you're going to see. Same thing with Hindus, Buddhists, or anyone else. And again, that doesn't mean that the experience is fake. It just means that the brain, when under stress, seems to draw on whatever symbolic and emotional language is available to make sense of what's happening. If your culture believes, even in a story you haven't heard since you were 5, that the dead cross a river, your brain might project a river. If your religion believes in divine light, that light might be what your brain reaches for in a moment of surrender. So we have to be very careful about making universal claims. If Jesus shows up in American NDEs and Yama shows up in Indian ones, and someone else sees a glowing fox or a comforting orb of light, we should not assume that any one version is the truth, the ultimate truth about what happens after death. What we should be asking is the question you would ask after a dream or a psychedelic trip, which is, what does this say about you, rather than what does this say about ultimate reality? So that's even true when people have similar experiences, because what a lot of people will do when they don't have kind of good science driving this is they'll say that because multiple people are having the same experience, it must therefore then speak to something true. But it is not that simple. People who do DMT will see space elves or the blue lady. It's a very common theme. If you go into this space, people are always talking about what they talk to the space elves about, and swapping stories. That does not therefore mean that there is literally a race of interdimensional elves welcoming people into hyperspace. It means that the human brain, under similar chemical conditions, can generate similar symbolic imagery. Mormons go into temples and see their dead loved ones. Does that mean that it's real? Does that mean that Mormonism is true? Like, cultures across the world, even cultures that don't touch each other, will develop stories about dragons. Like, have you been down that rabbit hole? I spent like a week in that rabbit hole where, like, it seems like dragons show up everywhere in our history, and people will be like, oh, it's because of bones. Like they're not doing archaeology here. They're not finding dinosaur bones. We have stories of dragons, this collective memory about how terrifying a flying reptile would be, even in cultures that don't touch each other. Now, because that exists in our history, does that therefore mean that dragons exist? Like, maybe, but not necessarily. There could be something about our collective memory and the fact that we are related to each other and have common ancestries and common archetypal stories that we could be tapping into. It does not therefore mean that dragons are real just because multiple cultures that don't touch each other have stories about dragons. So here's another example of how subjective experiences don't mean that there's something out there that's objectively real. And this, I think, is really powerful. Like, this is evidence that I want to plop down on the table. There's something called the third man syndrome. It's also called the third hiker effect. I'm fascinated by this. This is when people in extreme survival situations, mountaineers, sailors lost at sea, explorers in the Arctic, report feeling another being with them, a comforting figure. Sometimes it feels like a friend or a guide or protector. And this person will often have valuable information, like, hey, buddy, you are too high in altitude. You need to get up and keep walking down the mountain. And this happens a lot. You'll find the same kind of stories from completely unrelated people in totally different places. And the thing that we can know for sure is that we know that that hiker wasn't there. We know that that hiker wasn't on that summit. And so these people aren't even necessarily religious or spiritual. Sometimes they're hard-nosed scientists or lifelong atheists, but in a moment of stress and exhaustion and crisis, the brain has this ability to project out a helpful guide that will then talk to you during times of danger and really extreme survival situations. So just because people see a third hiker who gives them helpful advice does not mean that there is a spirit or angel that helps hikers, or that a real hiker was there, or there's like a patron of everyone who's in a dangerous situation. All of this could be happening at the level of the brain, and the similarities that we see could be because our brains are similar. If you're watching this, you'll notice that I have an outfit change. That's because it's the next day, but I forgot to share my favorite example. And so I literally got dressed and came down to the she shed to add this to the video. But another big example of what's going on here and the rabbit hole that I've been down lately is looking at people who experience G-lock, which is like gravity-induced loss of consciousness, something like that. And it happens to fighter pilots or astronauts during extreme acceleration. Usually when pulling many Gs in tight turns or maneuvers, blood gets forced out of the brain and down into the lower body, which causes brain oxygen deprivation. And they report having tunnel vision, euphoria and peaceful feelings, floating sensations, out-of-body experiences, bright lights, seeing heaven, life reviews, dreamlike memories, encountering beings and family members. In other words, G-lock causes the same features as NDEs. And these events happen while the pilot is very much not dead, just like unconscious or hypoxic. And so fighter pilots, you can read these, and they've been trained to expect this and report on G-lock, but they will describe their blackouts like this. Like I've been reading them over and over. This is a quote: "The most peaceful, beautiful moment of my life. I saw a light, I felt love, I saw memories, and then I woke up in the cockpit." And this sounds identical to many NDE testimonies, but there's less metaphysics attached because we have this sense that if it's happening with a near-death experience, maybe it's a moment where, you know, your consciousness or your soul is leaving your body. But then how can this be happening in the same way with brain deprivation because of G-lock? Does that mean that they're going fast enough that their soul is leaving their body? Like, it just doesn't have the same kind of metaphysics attached because they're not dying. And so G-lock doesn't disprove NDEs, but it offers this compelling, repeatable, very measurable model for how the brain can experience these kind of afterlife experiences without the person actually dying. It shifts the frame from proof of heaven to, oh, this seems to be a very powerful subjective experience caused by brain chemistry under extreme conditions, and we can actually induce this in people, and they don't even have to be dying in order to actually feel an out-of-body, feel love and light kind of near-death experience. You can go be strapped into one of these things and they can spin you and you can experience that. So when people say, because a lot of people see the same thing, therefore it must be true, we have to pause and say, like, true in what way? Because shared experiences can come from shared neurology, shared symbols, shared stories, shared emotional needs, not necessarily from a shared external reality. Otherwise, the blue lady exists, and aliens exist, and space elves exist, and third hikers exist. So I don't think that we have enough evidence to rule out naturalistic explanations for this. So let's talk about one of the most powerful parts of a near-death experience also, which is the overwhelming feeling of love and peace. If you listen to enough NDE accounts, this is the part people struggle the most to describe. They'll say things like, I felt completely accepted. I was surrounded by love that was bigger than anything that I've ever felt on earth, and it was more real than anything that I've ever experienced. Some people say that they felt merged with everything, or that they finally remembered who they were. So again, like, let's acknowledge that this is not unique to NDEs. The same feeling of cosmic love and peace comes up in other states too. Deep meditation, childbirth, psychedelic experiences, listening to music, especially in a group. All of these, the sense of self drops away, and what takes its place is often something more expansive. So what are the explanations? You know, one possibility comes from neurochemistry. When the brain believes that death is imminent, it goes into a kind of shutdown mode, and during this process, it can release massive amounts of endorphins, dopamine, even possibly DMT, which is a naturally occurring, psychedelic effect. These chemicals are known to produce intense euphoria, feelings of unity, a blurring of the boundary between self and universe. In other words, your brain might be trying to comfort you as you die. Instead of letting you panic, it gives you kind of a neurochemical morphine drip, flooding you with peace and awe as your systems are painfully being shut down. Some researchers even speculate that this might be evolution's way of making death less terrifying, the same way that our subconscious, we know from terror management studies, is doing so much to compartmentalize death so that it's in the background. Maybe as we're dying, this is evolution's way of making death less painful and less terrifying. Another explanation is the default mode network deactivation. We talk a lot on this channel and other places in spirituality about the default mode network, which is the part of the brain that gives you a sense of self. It's your inner narrator, your ego, the part of you that feels like I'm a me and I'm separate from everything else. So when people take psychedelics like psilocybin or undergo extreme stress, this network will go offline. And what that does is that people will report a loss of ego and this sense of being like one with the universe, because you no longer have that like inner narrator. And again, you can do this with drugs or meditation. We can watch your brain while you feel this. Some people will say, I felt pure love, or I felt like one with everything. And that may be exactly what it feels like when that part of your brain that creates an identity goes quiet because you're dying. Now let's talk about the life review, because this one's interesting. This one shows up so often in near-death experiences that it almost becomes expected. We just have this normal phrase in society that my entire life flashed before my eyes. But it's not like watching a movie. They describe like reliving key moments, but from the perspective of others. They feel what their mom felt when they slammed the door as a teenager. They feel the hurt of the stranger they snapped at in traffic. Some say they re-experience small, forgettable moments, but with huge emotional weight, like sharing a toy on the playground or comforting someone who is sad. And it's often described as this like panoramic, hyper emotional, non-judgmental but immersive experience of one's life. And many people say as they're coming out of it that they want to live differently, more kindly, more intentionally, because they're aware of how their actions ripple out into the universe. So the question is like, why would a brain do this? If you're dying, why not just fade to black? Why the sudden like emotional highlight reel? And there's a few possibilities. I don't know. I'm just talking possibilities. First, we know that memory gets weird under extreme circumstances. People who have been in car accidents or combat sometimes say that their whole life flashed before their eyes. It's not just a metaphor. There's research that under intense adrenaline spikes or trauma, your brain can retrieve and compress an enormous amount of memory content in a very short amount of time. This is sometimes called time dilation, where seconds can feel like minutes or hours. When someone is near death, their brain may be doing one last full system scan, accessing deep emotional memory to make sense of what's happening. The brain may be trying to contextualize what's about to occur by looking back over everything that led to this moment. Some researchers call this final integration, a kind of psychological reckoning or narrative closure where the brain is just trying to sort through things in order to make sense, but it's also running out of oxygen to be able to do that. And so it just kind of shows up at these random memories. There's also the theory that the brain is trying to resolve unfinished business by tying up narrative ends, because of course our brains are storytellers. It's making peace. It's revisiting what mattered, because what we know about the brain is that it is deeply narrative. It wants coherence. It wants resolution. And in the face of death, the brain might be trying its best to provide that, a final act of meaning making, even if it's happening in a few seconds of neural fireworks. So does that mean that it's all imaginary? Like, no, it just means that the brain is doing what the brain does, creating order out of chaos, pulling emotion and memory and identity together in one attempt to understand what's happening to it. And it's also maybe looking for information that may be helpful for what's happening right now by sorting through things. The fact that you can experience that life flash before my eyes many other ways than just near-death experiences tells me that this is something that brains can do, either to look for information or create meaning out of a situation, or both, or to tie up loose ends. So I think you get my drift so far, but let's talk about a few of the popular NDE stories that people always come back as proof that all of my skepticism is bullshit, essentially. So these stories are very powerful. They're emotional. That's why they feel so convincing. But when we take a closer look, we often find that what makes the story convincing isn't the evidence, it's the storytelling. It's the emotion. It's the hindsight bias. It's the details we fill in after the fact. So here are some of the most famous ones. The first one is Ibn Alexander. I actually don't know how to say some of these names because I've only read these names. It's one of those instances where like I don't actually listen to a lot of NDE YouTubes, but I will read about it. So I'm going to go with Eben, for Eben, Alexander, Proof of Heaven. This is probably the most famous modern NDE story because he's a doctor and he's a neurosurgeon who had a severe brain infection and spent a week in a coma. And during that time, he said he went to a place of clouds and light, met a divine being, and learned that consciousness exists beyond the body. He says he couldn't have been hallucinating because his cortex was completely shut down. And this book sold millions of copies. It was a bestseller, and people clung to it as confirmation because he's a man of science. That's what made it so juicy. But here's the issue. When real neuroscientists reviewed his case, they found that his cortex was not fully shut down. He was in a coma, but he was not brain dead. He was still taking in information. And there's no reason to think that the experience couldn't have happened while he was coming out of the coma or even as he was going under while the brain was still more active. And in fact, some doctors involved in his treatment have publicly said that the science in his book is not accurate, the doctors that were involved in his treatment. So while the experience was profound for him, the claim doesn't hold up anything about afterlife or a sense of self that continues on after death. It just doesn't hold up under scrutiny because of the neuroscientists who reviewed his case and also the doctors who were on his case. The second one is The Heaven is for Real Boy. This one is super well known. A young boy named Colton had a near-death experience during surgery. He claimed to have visited heaven, met Jesus, and described events, here it is again, that he couldn't have known. Sounds impressive until you dig deeper. First, many of the details he shared were likely things that he overheard either before or after the surgery. Some of them were also things his parents had talked about, including the religious imagery that matched their evangelical beliefs. And over time, the story started to shift a little with each telling, which is exactly what we see in normal memory distortion. It's not lying. Your brain will do that on its own. It really is not lying. I'm not calling these people liars. I'm talking about normal memory distortion as you tell the story. And here's the kicker. Colton himself, later, when he grew up, admitted he made up some of the story because of pressure and attention, and especially this pressure coming from his evangelical parents. So again, the experience may have felt real, but it became a kind of feedback loop. The more people believed it, the more the story grew. That's not evidence. That's narratives. That's what humans do. That's King Arthur stories and Christianity and Mormonism and any religion that you've ever heard of. There is narrative inflation that you can actually track in real time. It doesn't mean that these people are liars. That's just what our brains do. The third one that I want to highlight is Pam Reynolds. This is the gold standard story. This one is called The Most Convincing NDE Ever Recorded. Pam Reynolds had a rare brain surgery in the 90s that required her to be in hypothermic cardiac arrest. Essentially, she was brought close to death. And during that time, she reported seeing surgical instruments, hearing conversations, and floating above her body. And people claim this is proof because she was clinically dead and her brain was inactive. But here's what the data actually shows. Pam was under anesthesia, not entirely brain dead. There were intervals during the surgery where her brain was still active. And when your brain is active, it is taking in even something like sounds when your eyes are closed. The tools, the music in the room, even the conversation could have easily been overheard before she was fully unconscious or as she was coming out of it. Our brain can log a lot of information we don't realize that we're hearing because her conscious ego mind is not online yet. And anesthesia awareness is a real and documented phenomenon. So while the experience was meaningful and strange, it doesn't prove that her soul left her body. It proves that memory is messy and that consciousness and perception are not just on-off switches, and we are more aware than we maybe thought we were when you're just kind of laying on a table like this, right? So what does this all mean? It means that these experiences are real. Like, I'm not debating that the interpretations, but the interpretations that people build around them are often not. People feel things, they remember things, they draw conclusions, they project things. And these conclusions are shaped by belief and culture and trauma and family pressure and book deals and even media coverage. And once you start looking into these stories critically, you notice a pattern. The more magical the story sounds, the more likely it is that details have been added, stretched, or misremembered over time. And the more likely you're also able to find a doctor who says, that's not really what happened. So we want these stories to be true. We only read like the magical ones, and it just feels so convincing that we just want it to be true so bad because we don't want to be afraid to die. So we make them all true without looking at the science too closely, which is what we know our brains do all the time. Religion is full of this. So after all this, after we've looked at the brain science, the cultural shaping, the debunked stories, you might wonder, is there actually any good argument for taking NDEs seriously as something more than brain activity? And I would say still yes. There's still an argument that gives me pause. It's the argument from veridical perception, which is people reporting seeing or hearing things during an NDE that they shouldn't have been able to perceive because they were unconscious or clinically dead at the time. So for example, someone flatlines in the hospital, their EEG shows no measurable brain activity, but when they're revived, it'll accurately describe something that just seems like, how could you possibly know that, even if you are accounting for subconscious information? And that story is rare, but it's not unheard of. And it makes some researchers, even skeptical ones, say like, I can't fully explain this. One of the most excited examples is from the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, led by Sam Parnia. This was a large multi-hospital study where researchers tried to catch these rare moments by placing hidden images in operating rooms, up on shelves, that kind of thing, that if someone had an out-of-body experience, that they could be able to report the image. And not a single person, of course, has identified the images, but in a few cases, people did report specific things about what happened while they were technically dead that were later confirmed by hospital staff. Now, are these cases airtight? No. Critics point out that the EEGs don't pick up everything and that we don't fully understand the timing of memory formation under stress. This is still a lot of mystery as far as where the science is today, and that some of these memories might have been reconstructed afterward, but we don't have solid proof of that. So the best idea for NDEs is something like this. Sometimes people seem to know things that they seemingly shouldn't. Sometimes their experiences contain specific, verifiable information during a time when we don't understand how aware they could have been. And I will admit, I will hear stories where, I cannot fully explain how memory could have been formed for what they could have known or what could have happened or not happened. But 99% of NDE phenomena, I really think, can be better explained by brain chemistry, trauma response, culture, brain projection. We really can explain the vast majority of these stories with just good science and naturalistic neuroscientific explanations. But even that 1%, like let's say that some of these stories are actually true, the ones that we can't quite explain or we have to consider as something happening that speaks to something greater, we have to ask the question, is that happening more than normal? Because for every magical NDE story, there are hundreds or thousands where people don't have a typical NDE story, where things just went black, or they say they felt like something was happening and it wasn't happening. But because it doesn't fit the pattern of what we want, we forget all those. So even if there are a few hits that are magical, when you look closer, it's not like it's happening at higher rates than random. Whenever you apply solid science to this, it just starts to break down for me. Now, does that mean that I know for sure that there's no life after death? No, there's no like smoking gun here where I can know for sure that NDEs aren't pointing to something real. It's kind of like the argument for atheism. Atheism isn't, I know for sure that there is no God. It's saying there is not enough evidence for me to be convinced of a God. And I really do think that's the most rational response when you look at all of this data. You cannot know for sure that all NDEs are explicable at the level of the brain, and there's nothing kind of magical going on here. But you can, I think, say, I don't have enough evidence to make that kind of leap into the supernatural when so many naturalistic explanations are still on the table. That, I think, is the most rational stance. And so I think we can explain with natural explanations. And then the part that's still perhaps mysterious, where like the edges of the map of our current understanding, we can still be open to whatever ends up being true. But that does not mean that a lack of scientific knowledge somewhere is the same as evidence to make a big supernatural leap. There is no evidence for NDEs pointing to an afterlife or life after, or something, information about consciousness that should make you have a confident leap into the supernatural. Is it possible? Is it an explanation on the table? Sure. But always remember that, like, it is far more likely statistically, when we look back in history, that science is going to fill that gap rather than the supernatural, because every single other time in history where we were at the edge of science and jumped into a supernatural explanation when there were still natural explanations on the table, we were wrong 100% of the time. That process only goes in one direction. So can we know for sure that there's this proves there's no soul or no afterlife? No, we can't say that. I'm not saying that. But do you have enough evidence to jump into the supernatural, even for those few cases where we feel like there's a little bit of mystery? No, I don't think we have any kind of evidence like that. What we have is 99% naturalistic explanations and 1% a little bit of mystery, because we're at the edge of the map of scientific understanding of memory in the brain. That's what we have here. I think that's not a strong enough jump to jump into, like, oh, a kid saw Jesus, therefore I know that Christianity is true and that's reality. Like, there's no evidence to make that kind of leap. The only reason we are making that kind of leap is because of the real thing that's going on underneath all of this, which is how hard we try, and our brains try without even us being aware of it, how hard we try to cheat death, how hard we try to use even science and rationality because of our emotional fears of death that may be so underneath the surface we don't even know that that's what's pulling on the strings here. It is not a coincidence that religious people who deconstruct their religion, the first thing they get into is NDEs. Their brain is looking for a story to deal with death and a way to cheat death literally the day after they leave religion. Whereas people who have a lot of tools for their fear of death and they've processed it don't seem to go down this rabbit hole with the same level of intensity or faith, because they don't need anything here to be true. And so I want to touch on something that doesn't get talked about enough: why so many people are deconstructing their religion and how they're ending up in near-death experience content. And I say this with no judgment, like I've been there, but here's what I think is going on. When someone deconstructs their religion, or they feel like they're just struggling in general, even if they weren't raised in religion, your story is collapsing. And what's left behind is this kind of terrifying silence. It's not intellectual silence, but more like emotional disorientation. If you were in religion, you'll go from, like, I don't know what happens when I die, to I have no idea what happens. If you're from religion, you go, I know what happens when I die, to I have no idea what happens and I might just disappear forever. And the brain does not like that kind of gap. The moment that certainty gets pulled out, especially around death, the brain goes hunting for a replacement, for a new story, a softer one, a more modern one, something that gives you some kind of narrative continuity, even if you don't want to go back to religion. And so that's where kind of NDE content shows up the most, as this kind of spiritual methadone. It feels like a middle ground. It's not organized religion. It's not dogma. It's not like, this old school, like there's an afterlife, but you're going to burn in hell forever. But it still gives you this glimpse of hope. Hey, there's a neuroscientist over here that believes in near-death experiences. It gives you a glimpse of light, of meaning. It helps you feel like something continues after death, even if you don't have to believe in like a Santa Claus kind of God anymore. And again, like, this is understandable, this is human, but contrast that with someone who's gone through a secular process of death acceptance, someone who's sat with their mortality, someone who has grieved the loss of the afterlife story, someone who has done the psychological and philosophical work to make peace with not knowing. When those people encounter NDE stories, they might still be interested, they might even be moved, but they don't dive into it with the same kind of urgency or emotional dependency, because they don't need to believe. They can just kind of like hold it loosely, read some stories, read a few books. Oh yeah, there's a few options on the table. And they've developed tools that kind of just allow them to live in that ambiguity. But they don't tend to like have faith that this has to be real because this is where I have my last morsel of hope. Because you don't need to do that if you've actually faced death. So I think what's happening here is not really about whether or not NDEs are pointing to something more real or magical or whatever. I think what's really happening is, what is the emotional scaffolding you've built around the fear of death? And if you just left religion, or you're in a place in your life where you're raw and vulnerable, NDEs can feel like a lifeline. Because if you've already processed death, or built a secular spirituality kind of story that can hold loss and impermanence, you don't really need the NDE story to be magic as much. You can just appreciate that this seems to be a thing that happens to people when they're dying, without clinging to any truth claims around it. So the popularity of NDE content among people deconstructing faith isn't a coincidence. It's a narrative trauma response. That's what's going on at the deeper level. So if I have a client who says they're super into NDEs, I will write down in my notes, we need to do some death work. Because here's what happens every time. If you do the death work first and then go back to the NDE stories, then it's just stories. I wonder what's going on here. What an interesting story. You don't need anything to be true. You can hold on to many perspectives, many opinions and stories on the table. You can discuss it and watch YouTube videos, but it's like playful curiosity. And you don't get that from people who are using NDEs as their scaffold against death, or their last place where there's some hope that there's something more going on here. So from them, they will attack me or bear testimony or do a lot of what about isms, just like people in religion. And they are actually, whether they know it or not, having a religious faith and relationship with NDEs as the story that their brain is using to have hope and cheat death. So my advice is always the same. I don't know exactly what happens after we die. I don't think there's a smoking gun for either side. But my advice is, face death first. Be totally okay with the fact that you're going to die, and that maybe that means lights out. Really be okay with that deep down into your bones. Then go down the NDE rabbit hole if you want to. And when people do that, yeah, there's some mystery from time to time, but most of the time we see that there are many naturalistic explanations for this human brain behavior. But here, before I blow up everybody's hope about this, here's the most poetic that I can get about NDEs. I'll try to give you something here that I think is actually beautiful. Even if near-death experiences are just brain activity, if we find a smoking gun for this thing, there is something kind of beautiful about the brain doing that at all. Think about it. Your body is failing. Your systems are shutting down. Your heart has stopped. Your brain is under extreme stress. Your mind doesn't fill, some people's do, but overall, your mind doesn't fill that moment with horror. Your brain decides to overload your experience with chemicals that give you peace, with calm, with light, with love. Even if there's no soul, even if there's no afterlife, your brain doesn't abandon you. It gives you this final gift, this last story that it's trying to make out of your experience. Not fear, but a kind of transcendence. It offers you the feeling that you're being held, that you're letting go into something vast and warm, that you're connected, that your life had meaning, that you're not alone, that there's nothing to be afraid of. And that's not nothing. That's not a failure of science. That's not a glitch in the system. That's your mind doing what it's always done, protecting you, interpreting your experience, finding meaning in a meaningless universe, helping you transition through the biggest unknown any of us will ever face. And there is something awe-inspiring about that, even if it's just us, right? You don't need a belief in heaven or a divine plan to see the poetry in that. The fact that nature, through nothing but evolution and neurons, has built a system that gives you a hug and soothes you as you die is deeply human. It shows that even in a universe that might not care, we care for ourselves down to our very biology. It's like when people get really sad at the fact that when they were talking to God, they were actually talking to themselves. But then they'll make this switch where they realize, oh my God, every time I was getting insight from God, it was actually me. And there's some beauty in that too, even if we weren't talking to God when we were praying. And so maybe the comfort that we crave at the end doesn't have to come from the outside. Maybe this is all coming from within. Maybe the final act of consciousness is one of grace, whether you believe in God or not. So no, I don't believe NDEs prove an afterlife or anything about consciousness. I don't particularly feel moved by them. But there is something beautiful about when my brain recognizes that the curtain is starting to fall, the brain might still find a way to hand me a moment of peace. What is beautiful to me is we all see that moment in the movies where another person is dying and someone's holding a person dying and saying like, your life had meaning, be at peace, right? I think the one that comes to mind is like in Les Mis, and I forgot the names. Sorry, my brain in the summer, because I'm home with my kids, is like so scattered. But like she's been shot and she's bleeding out, and they're like singing to each other, and he's like holding her. It's this moment, right? Or it's Lord of the Rings, King Theoden going to the hall of his fathers with honor. It's Katniss holding Rue and singing a song, right? It's in so many of our stories and movies, and it's beautiful that as my systems are shutting down, and it's so scary to go on this final and last journey into death, that the thing that's actually holding you in that moment is your own brain, reviewing your life, filling you with peace, allowing you to float away without fear. Not that all near-death experiences are like that, of course. Some see nothing, some go to hell and like experience like just this awful terror. But if you do have a beautiful experience, I almost think that it's more meaningful that it came from not a God, but from me. What do you think?